You're watching BBC News. I'm Shaun Ley with the latest headlines. President Joe Biden says the US has made clear to the Taliban that any attack on the Afghan evacuation mission will be met quickly and with force. But President Biden said he was in constant contact with the Taliban. The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, says several of the bloc's members have suggested extending the deadline for evacuation out of Kabul beyond the 31st of August. Boris Johnson says he has full confidence in his Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab after criticism of his handling of the crisis. Mr Raab has come under pressure for failing to call the Afghan Foreign Minister last Friday over evacuation plans. And there's been mounting anger in Haiti over the slow delivery of aid to areas affected by Saturday's earthquake. Damage to roads is hampering access. More than 2,000 people died in the quake. Many more were injured. Those are the headlines. Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us on Saturday morning. Joining me tonight, Kate Proctor. Kate is editor of Politics Home, and the business journalist John Crowley. Well, most of tomorrow's front pages lead with the continuing crisis in evacuating British, American and other foreign nationals, as well as those who worked with the coalition from Afghanistan. The Financial Times leads with a pledge from President Joe Biden issued Friday evening, vowing to get Americans out of Afghanistan. The admission that the president that not everyone will get out is pointed up in the Telegraph. The Eye says the UK is considering sending British forces and British diplomats into the crowds outside of the airport security zone to search for those who are entitled to be on board flights leaving Kabul. The Times says thousands of UK allies face being left behind in Afghanistan if the operation ends soon. And the anguish at Kabul airport is captured on the Guardian front page as a baby is passed into the hands of soldiers to try and escape Taliban rule. A possible threat to the UK from the Taliban takeover leads the Mirror. It quotes security experts warning of a clear and present danger to the UK. And a very different story on the front of the Express Saturday morning. It leads on the new drug in the fight against coronavirus aimed at those who can't have vaccination and injections. So let's plunge straight in. Kate, do you want to kick us off this evening with, I mean, we're going to talk quite a lot about Afghanistan over the last quarter of an hour or so, but let's start with the FT, which has that very powerful image of a tearful woman hoping to get on a truck at the border with Iran, hoping to get out of Afghanistan.
Sure. So the FT leads on, some of the most important news emerging today, which is the speech that President Joe Biden gave, which is where he said that they would, try and get people out of Afghanistan. He talked about the timescale in which they could do that. Notably, he said that any American who wants to get home will be able to. There's also a fact in this FT story that the US have been able to get 13,000 people flown out of Kabul since August the 14th. And all of this is President Biden really trying to be on the front foot after receiving such a lot of criticism globally for his response to what's happened in Afghanistan. I think the point of this press conference was to give the impression that America is trying its best to get people out. But as we'll see in the other papers and the way that this is covered, it's an extremely difficult situation still. And I think he's still under an awful lot of pressure, and criticism remains for the way that he's handled all of this.
John, I mean, it's very striking, isn't it, that, I mean, as Kate says, the tone of that news conference earlier, addressed to the nation, which he gave, but he also took questions afterwards, was very much the president insisting that this is America in control of the situation. It's secured the airport. What other power could exercise that kind of military control hundreds of thousands of miles away? But certainly the reporting in the Telegraph, in the FT and in the other papers, rather suggests a different message, doesn't it? To the point even the FT quoting officials are saying UK special forces are on standby to snatch people out of Taliban-held territory if that becomes necessary, if the Taliban suddenly say, sorry, you can't have access to the airport anymore.
Yes, absolutely. This press conference at the White House was desperately trying to project a sense of calm, as Kate was just saying there. And it follows this, well, what can only be described as a car crash interview with ABC News just a few days earlier, in which he came across as unfeeling and really touchy at the criticism, and very much kind of alone or on his own. And he was flanked by his main people on that press conference tonight. As Kate said, yes, the FT reveals that 13,000 Afghanis and Americans have managed to have been flown out so far this year. There was also a telling line, you were talking about the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. He's also quoted in this piece as saying, at the moment, we have more planes than passengers at the moment, which again speaks to what is happening in the other papers that we're going to look at now.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because Boris Johnson was insisting in the Commons only on Wednesday that, you know, there's no question, or actually, and I think Ben Wallace as well, the Defence Secretary, no question of flights leaving with empty spaces. You know, we're getting people on board, but it's clearly a much murkier picture, John, than that. I mean, again, Telegraph, I think I said in the introduction, it's a baby being handed over. It looks to me like a toddler, actually, in this photograph on the front of the Telegraph, being hoisted up and helped by a British paratroopers above and a US Marine below. These images are very striking, aren't they, of people so desperate to get out of Afghanistan. And one wonders how long the Taliban are going to tolerate this rather unattractive image being projected to the world, never mind within its own country.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just scenes of chaos. BBC viewers will have watched Secunda Kamani's piece from outside of a British compound. We had British soldiers forcibly pushing away people, kind of brandishing British passports, and that's obviously happening to the Americans as well. You kind of wonder what deal has been struck with the Taliban behind closed doors about this agreement, that they're not allowed to obviously engage with US-UK troops until this airlift finishes, whenever that happens. But you do fear what happens. We're hearing about killings and attacks already. There was a family member of Deutsche Welle, a German news organization's journalist who was murdered by the Taliban. And you do fear what will happen when NATO troops eventually leave.
Yeah, Telegraph, interestingly, Kate saying quite explicitly, and Biden acknowledges they may not get out, and the implication is they may not get out, and they may well then become subject to retribution, whatever the rhetorical stuff from Taliban leaders at that news conference earlier in the week. Again, stories emerging from parts of the country, some of which quoted here, that Taliban locally at least have been going around in some of those areas they'd already occupied for some time, basically kind of rounding people up.
Well, that's right. And Joe Biden admitted that this is extremely dangerous, this airlift, and they won't be able to get everybody out. And not only that, but in the process of trying to get people into the airport and out of the airport, he's suggesting that there is a risk of loss. So whether it's around the airport or whether it's, right across the country in remote areas, this situation is extremely dangerous. It's extremely fractious, and I think this piece is quite important, really, because it talks about this deadline. How much time can we actually give to the airlift? And there's some pressure on Joe Biden. He said he believes it will be able to be done by the end of August, but there is some pressure, of course, that if you don't get everyone out by then, you're going to have to extend that period of time. But that's still 11 days away, and I think it's very fast moving. I'm sure we'll be talking about something very different in a few days' time. But at the moment, there's pressure to extend it if you can't get everyone out.
Kate, I now correct myself, having corrected myself once. I'm going to re-correct myself. There is a baby. In fact, the baby's on the front of the Times and the Guardian.
That's right.
It's interesting, this, isn't it, Kate? This is it's a very grainy image that they've blown up. The Guardian has taken it slightly wider. In its picture, with Emma Graham Harrison's kind of authored report on the front of the paper, and the quote from it, "We should all hang our heads in shame." It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we've got the papers we've talked about so far, including the Times, taking a very kind of detached sort of journalistic view, trying to see the wider picture as well as picking up the emotion. The Guardian has gone for the emotion, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different take. And I suppose not least, of course, a reminder that if you can get journalist to describe some of those scenes, you get a different perspective. You take it away from the Bidens and the Johnsons and the commentators and the soldiers, and you take the human side. It really does have an impact.
And I think it's really important that we see images like this. You know, they'll be enduring. They'll be the things that we remember in years to come from this particularly awful moment in history. And of course, it's the emotion and it's seeing the people, which makes sense of the fact of, you know, when we're talking about asylum policy and immigration policy and how the UK is going to help people in Afghanistan, you know, it's really important that, you know, as Brits, we understand and we see who it is that we're talking about. You know, the people that are most at risk. When we're talking about vulnerable people, we're talking about that baby that is being lifted into the arms of a soldier there.
Yeah, and quite possibly by, you know, from a family of adults who were themselves either children or not even born the last time the Taliban were in power. I mean, John, what do you take from this? Because it is, you know, there is a sense, and again, listening to Biden, particularly in that interview earlier in the week, and even later in the week, of, look, you know, this is a war largely forgotten by the Americans, partly because they were no longer fighting and therefore there were no casualties to constantly be reported on the news. Do you think it's the same in this country as well? Do you think we kind of largely parked Afghanistan as, you know, along with 9/11, something that happened in recent history, but not something that has any direct relevance to our lives now?
Well, the Daily Mirror actually addresses that and says if you think this is something that's happening in a faraway land, this terror threat that will come back. I think it's Colonel Richard Kemp, who served with distinction in Afghanistan in 2003 and 2004, and is saying that the terrorists will exploit this Taliban rule, whether they work with them or not, that there will be a landscape where they'll be allowed to foment and plan attacks on the West. And actually just what Kate was saying there about The Guardian being emotional, or us talking about it being emotional. No, I think it was actually you who said that about being emotional. I think it's just bringing home that this is a humanitarian crisis. This is affecting human beings. So everyone's talking about the grand powers and the shifting tectonic plates and what this means. You know, people are suffering out there really, really badly. And I just go back to those scenes on the BBC where you had, you know, so British passport holders, UK citizens out there who were being pushed away by British servicemen, you know, perhaps for very good reason, because they were just trying to maintain control. But there is a problem with process at the moment. They can't process these people. And as you said, with the I newspaper, the reason that British military forces are considering going in and kind of doing these rescue trips is because it's just absolute carnage outside Kabul airport and outside, you know, places where British soldiers are. You just cannot process these people. And I think in one of the pieces, I think it's the Times, they say there's 6,000 people that still needs to be processed. And this has just been happening for 4 or 5 days. If you think about the Berlin airlift, that took 11 months. Yes. They were bringing stuff in. Yes. We're trying to take human beings kind of out of there, and it's just 5 days in. And to think that you can take thousands of people out in these conditions is just beyond comprehension.
Kate, the eye is interesting, isn't it? Because I haven't seen this line elsewhere specifically. I've seen the point about UK Special Forces being on standby, I think in the FT or the Telegraph. But this line, you know, time is running out, not least because, of course, never mind the deadline which Biden has set, 31st of August. Actually, even he himself has said that it may not be met. They'll aim for it. He was asked about that at the news conference this evening. But the idea of British troops surrounding diplomats, escorting them out in defiance of the Taliban, that's only going to happen if there is some negotiation with the Taliban. And again, I take it back to the thought before. How long will the Taliban tolerate this idea of its own sovereign, its own land, as it sees it, with foreign troops? The whole point was to get them out, kind of wandering the streets on their own terms to extract people, some of whom the Taliban may contest whether they should even be able to leave Afghanistan.
I think it's possible that although the Taliban has taken Kabul, it's not the place where they enjoy the strongest amount of support. So it might be that the way that they act and react to seeing US British soldiers there might be this period of time in which there seems to be some kind of understanding that people need to leave, although it's extremely chaotic, that might continue more so than if the Taliban, more so than if it was in another part of the country where the Taliban have much more sort of loyal support from people that live there. But yes, so much of this is about exactly how long the Taliban will take having their airport run by other nations, essentially, and it feels like it's been days and days already, and it's difficult to really establish at this particular point in time how much longer they'll give. But I mean, we're still talking about thousands of people need to leave, and you look at every single front page, and it's just absolute chaos. With it's hard to work out how anyone could get on a plane looking at some of those scenes.
Yeah. I wonder what you make of the Mirror front page, clear and present danger to the UK, because at every stage we've heard Joe Biden, Boris Johnson, others saying, look, the Al-Qaeda problem has been solved insofar as it was related to Afghanistan. Bin Laden is dead. Well, he was executed by the Special Forces operation, of course, ironically in Pakistan, an American ally by Obama, without telling the Pakistani government, because they clearly didn't trust them not to tip him off. Is this a region that is this a problem that is going to come back and haunt? I mean, is that the impression, the experts you're talking to at Politics Home are giving your colleagues, that this is something that, is not going to be parked once America, Britain and the others finally quit?
Well, I think it's a very realistic assessment that Colonel Richard Kemper's made. He's former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and he's basically suggesting that the Taliban will shelter terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and potentially allow them to plan and launch terror attacks on the West, something that we saw happen in 9/11. I think when you've got someone with that authority and that much knowledge of a region giving that kind of warning, I think you have to take that extremely seriously. And it seems credible to me for sure that if you have this regime back in power again, that some of those incredible protections that we've had and that we've enjoyed for the last 20 years are going to be somewhat diminished. So I think it's really good actually that the Mirror has gone on this line. I think it's something the public need to wake up to.
I mean, that is the danger, I suppose, isn't it, for both British and Americans and in other capitals? There would sort of be a relief, the idea that their troops are coming home, John. But again, it's sort of back to where we started. The reason 9/11 happened was because of the funding of Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan, partly by the West and its allies like Pakistan, in order to undermine the Soviet occupation in the early 1980s. It becomes a case of my enemy's enemy is my friend. Unfortunately, when your enemy stops being your enemy, you turn around and find your friend is a fair weather friend. I mean, there are a lot of complications that will be opened up. And one of my interviews earlier, Vincent Moon from The Guardian, is describing it as another Pandora's box.
Absolutely. And let's remember the US or NATO only decided to intervene kind of 5 years after the Taliban took control. They were committing heinous acts against women and all manner of people for 5 years before. And obviously, Joe Biden desperately wanted to get out of Afghanistan before the anniversary, which is coming up in a few weeks, of 9/11. That was, he said that on the record. The thing about this for me is when you're talking about Joe Biden saying, this is a problem solved now, we won't have this. And then we're saying, well, there will be terror attacks on the rest, is that Biden and Johnson are clearly not in lockstep together. And when you think of the special relationship before, when you think of Thatcher and Reagan and Blair and Bush, and you can argue, whether the things they did together were good or not, or who had the upper hand in those relationships. At least, they moved in lockstep together. It is clear that Johnson and Biden are not moving in lockstep. And you've looked at the way at the G7 summit this summer, when there was parlaying going on, and there was a lot of bonhomie, but behind the scenes, I don't think they really clicked. Let's be fair about it. And I think this is a massive problem here for the UK. They have been kept completely in the dark about what's happened. And apparently they're talking now. Apparently they're talking a lot more. We certainly hope they're collaborating more right at this moment. But it's clear that that there's been a failure in the UK-US relationship, certainly over Afghanistan right now.
Yeah. Kate, your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that's probably correct. I mean, I don't think that they are, political bedfellows, really. I think their partners appeared to get on better at the G7 than anything we saw between the two men. I would say, though, we've had a real jolt, haven't we, about the security and the intelligence that our country is receiving and the US is receiving. And so just to go back to that Mirror story to say, that there is a clear and present danger of terrorist attacks to the UK, I feel like we've had a really worrying time actually with our level of intelligence and foresight. So I think that I would assume that this coming and just out of the blue for some people, we're going to have a real assessment of the information and the security intelligence that we're getting in this country.
Yeah, I think some of it feels very similar to the discussions we had after Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, doesn't it? About whether our intelligence was as good as we had convinced ourselves it was. John Crowley, Kate Proctor, thank you both very much. They will be back with more papers just after 11:30, and I'm going to tease you a bit. There are other stories on the front pages. I'm not going to tell you much about them, except I'm going to say one involves COVID and one involves your Christmas turkey. Come back 11:30 to find out more. Goodbye for now.